Welcome to the New Books Network.
Cancel culture is something all academics are aware of and some are concerned about. And I'm joined today by Greg Lukianoff, who was the co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, which made a big impact, and who has now co-authored The Cancelling of the American Mind. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And can we just start with The Coddling of the American Mind, just to set the scene, as it were, and remind ourselves of what you said there? Basically, you were concerned about censorship on campus.
Yes, but also mental health. I've been defending freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus for 22 years now. And around 2014, we started noticing what I identified as sort of distorted thinking around the medicalization of censorship. And because of my own struggles with anxiety and depression, I recognize that a lot of the sort of catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, doomsaying, emotional reasoning were the kind of mental habits that wouldn't just be bad for free speech, because people were saying, like if this person comes to my campus, people will be mentally crushed, by them being here. That and as an excuse for deplatforming, that it would be bad for academic freedom and free speech, but also disastrous for the mental health of young people. So the focus of coddling of the American mind is much more on everything from parenting to social media to K through 12, to create this perfect storm that was both bad for academic freedom and free speech, but also a true disaster for the mental health of young people. And what's interesting is I think younger people don't realize it wasn't always this way. Generally, if you wanted someone not to come, and actually in a lot of cases, people didn't, earlier in my career, certainly when I was in school in the 90s, the arguments usually weren't, don't let this speaker come. It was, I'm going to protest outside when the speaker's here. And moving more to this person shouldn't come here at all, or even worse, which really upticked around 2017, this professor needs to be fired for saying something controversial. That was not anywhere near as common as it has been for the last 10 years.
And the truth is, and you now document this, some professors have been fired.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, and mission number one of Canceling the American Mind is to establish that cancel culture is real, which we define as an uptick in campaigns to get people fired, deplatformed, expelled, etc., beginning around 2014, and the culture of fear that came from that. And, we looked at the entire sort of history of academic freedom in the United States. It didn't really begin until about between 1957 and 1973, when it became clear that the American First Amendment protects academic freedom and student freedom of speech. And looking back, there's no period anything even vaguely like this. So, in terms of the number of professors getting fired, we looked at over 1,000 examples of professors getting targeted since 2014, and about 2/3 of them were punished in some way. Almost 200 of them were fired, including something like 40 tenured professors. And to put this in perspective, the number of professors that they were believed to be fired for being communists during the Red Scare, according to the biggest study of the time, was about 63. There were additional, they usually round up to 100 when they count other professors fired for other reasons relating to their opinions. So it was only about 100. 100 is actually really, really bad. And now we're dealing with a situation where it's twice as many, even though the law is very clear in the United States that you're not supposed to be allowed to fire a professor for their political point of view. And we know that it's also just the tip of the iceberg, because when we asked professors how many of them had been investigated or threatened with investigation for their research speech for things protected by academic freedom, 1 in 6 said they had been, which was a number even shocking to me.
Right. So can you just take us through, first of all, to understand what's happening? Can you tell us about the tenure system? And I mean, many of our listeners actually will be familiar with this, but just to explain, how deep is the protection? I mean, I've always assumed before all this sort of era hit us, that it was rock solid, that you could not be fired, and that was the whole point of it.
You were completely right for most of my career as well. So the tenure system was something that there were different versions and suggestions of it going back, I think, long before the 19th century. But the American Association of University Professors in the United States in 1915 and then again in 1940 really argued for protecting, making it essentially impossible to fire a professor for their point of view, for their research, for their pedagogy. And for most of my life, tenure was rock solid. So, like I said, I've been doing this 22 years. The first decade I was around, I saw lots of professors punished. I don't think I saw. I think I maybe saw one tenured professor fired, and they had to have some other reason other than their academic freedom. I don't know exactly how this has happened to end up with 40 tenured professors fired, that suddenly it doesn't offer that much protection anymore. It doesn't seem to be a major change in the law, as best I can tell. But somehow, over the last 10 years, you're seeing a lot more professors that tenure doesn't even offer that much of a protection anymore.
Some people involved in this sort of thing, because it can get so nasty, would just sort of give up and think, I just really don't want to fight this, and I'll go home and read. But presumably some do want to fight. What happens when it gets to the courts, or has that never happened?
Oh, it does get to the courts, and one of the reasons why this is kind of surprising is oftentimes professors win. I talk about the very sad case of Mike Adams in the book, and he was a professor. He's a right wing professor with a kind of in your face kind of mentality, but also kind of a jokey. Like he was inspired, in his own words, by Lenny Bruce. And I defended him way back in 2001, right when I started, because he had sort of picked on a student. And actually, I just really responded, I think, actually in a relatively polite way, but to a student who said America had 9/11 coming to the whole campus. And she's like, well, you have the right to say that, just as the First Amendment protects, bigoted and silly thinking, something not even that harsh, basically. And that he got investigated back in 2001, and he was one of my first cases. And he got in trouble over and over again for some of his conservative speech. But he did go to court once to defend his denial of tenure on the basis of the idea that it was based on viewpoint, and he won in court. And in doing so, by the way, he actually won a major victory for about for in the entire Fourth Circuit, which is several states in the United States, including places like Virginia, that actually provided better academic freedom protections to everybody like in that circuit. But he's in the book also because he was someone who in 2020 he tweeted out something cracking a joke like he always was, and in this case he was likening lockdowns to slavery, and apparently that was considered too offensive. 2020 was a crazy year, and students organized against him. He got sort of forced out, but he got a severance package. And I thought of all the professors we were seeing that year, because it was basically a tsunami of professors asking for the help of my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Expression. And I checked in on him in mid-July of 2020, thinking he would be fine. Apparently, protesters were still coming to his house. They were still calling him on the phone. He had filed a police report because he was scared, and he killed himself the next week.
It is obviously awful to have students and your colleagues and everyone else sort of ganging up on you. I mean, you do talk about a witch hunt mentality at some point. Tell us about that.
We talk about that in Coddling the American Mind. And actually, we try to be kind of technical about it. We talk about Emil Durkheim's standards for witch hunt and make the point that even though the term is overused, when you have a situation, and by the way, this pattern repeats a lot. Someone says something, someone even like might publish an article, that is controversial. This happened back in 2017, I think. It was a professor who published something in a magazine called Hypatia that was arguing that essentially, if you can decide to change sex, you can also potentially be transracial. That essentially, if it's about self-identification as a thought experiment, couldn't you actually decide that you're Black, for example? And this was in the circumstance of Rachel Dolezal, a white person who famously pretended to be Black. Now, Interesting, provocative, sure, but this immediately led to what we would call sort of a cancel mob going after this one professor. And one of the things that really made it have the dynamic of a witch hunt is that people were privately apologizing to her, saying, listen, I know my name's on this petition against you, but I hate to see what's happening to you. But they felt like they had to in order to protect themselves. And that's the kind of hysteria you see that rightfully, is called more of a witch hunt.
You're talking about, now a significant number, a group who've been fired. How many of them would be, let's say, Republican rightists, and how many of them would be Democrats, leftists?
That's a little harder to tell. And we usually think what matters more is what direction it comes from. Because frankly, there are so few conservatives in higher education, particularly elite higher education, that you get sort of the wrong impression if you just counted the number of conservatives being fired, because there just aren't that many to be fired in the first place. But but there are lots of cases, by the way, where, and I say this as someone who considers himself, center left liberal, that you see a lot of cases where the sort of progressives come after the more old-fashioned liberals, and that a lot of the professors getting fired are from their left. But about 1/3, and we're very clear about this, we spend some time talking about right-wing cancel culture in this book, about 1/3 of the punishments actually come from usually the off-campus right. Why off-campus? Because frankly, on most campuses there aren't that many conservatives to begin with. But we've seen a number of cases where, let me give you one particularly galling example. At Babson College in Massachusetts, in another time of international strife, a professor there cracked a joke on Twitter about Trump's mentioning that he might actually attack holy sites in Iran during high levels of tension with them. And he wrote something that got written up on social media, like, Babson professor consults with Iran to give advice on where to bomb. And you see the tweet, and he's kind of like, yeah, Ayatollah Khomeini, you should attack our cultural sites. Here's a list. The Kardashian residence, the Mall of America. It's clearly like his joke is that there aren't really cultural centers in the United States. Like it's just a simple, obvious joke. This got treated like he was actually advising the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he got fired for that. And that was hysteria generated, by the right.
We're now in the middle of this Israel-Gaza issue, and it's very striking to me that a lot of the press in the UK and a lot of the politicians, I think even the Prime Minister, is basically insisting on particular language being used by the BBC and others, and people who are on the streets protesting in favor of the Palestinians are sometimes being arrested. So, I mean, that is part of the story too, isn't it? I mean, this Israel. I mean, this is one of the issues that leads to trouble.
Yeah, no, what we've been seeing going on in Europe is kind of horrifying to a lot of Americans. I think they banned like flying the Palestinian flag in France, for example. So some of the proposals over there in response to this are scaring us quite a bit. Meanwhile, in the United States, we've seen. I was lucky to start around 9/11 because right after 9/11, I got to see maybe. I think there were about 17 different professors targeted after 9/11, which, by the way, at the time was a lot. 3 of them lost their jobs. We defended all of these professors, of course, back then. 3 of them lost their jobs, but all 3 of them lost it for reasons other than their academic freedom. One of them had engaged in serious academic misconduct. The other one was found to have ties to Islamic terrorism, so they could fire you for that. So there was an uptick in people getting punished. Right now, we're in a little bit of what's going to happen? We've heard a couple reports of incidents in which a student might be being investigated for saying something that was pro-Hamas. We also see a case coming out of Stanford, which is actually easy in the other direction, where a professor singled out Jewish students, made them raise their hands, are you Jewish? Said that they were colonizers and made them gather their stuff and stand in the back of the room, and then continue to berate them, about claiming that that you colonizers have killed way more than 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. And that's something that you're banned just from anti-discrimination law in the United
Yeah,
States.
yeah.
So and we know this is just beginning. It's going to get ugly, but thankfully we haven't had the situation of protesters being arrested like we're seeing in Europe.
When you look at the TV arrangements, certainly in the UK, but I think in Europe generally, we have much more mainstream steady television, and you have these extreme TV channels, all on the basis of your free speech, constitutional rights and so on. But it's quite easy to argue that your TV system is feeding a culture war and is extremely unhealthy for your society, and that the regulations that exist on broadcasting in the UK and elsewhere in Europe are beneficial, and they do limit free speech. I mean, they do limit what the broadcasters can say.
Yeah, I don't think the problem with American media is freedom of speech or too much freedom of speech. I think it's market segmentation. I will happily own the fact that cable news is kind of a mess, and I mean that for Fox and MSNBC, but our equivalent of the BBC, NPR, hasn't exactly been covering itself in glory in some of these cases as well. So I don't, but yeah, I don't think the problem in the United States is too much free speech when it comes to this. But I still listen to BBC World News. I am also very aware, and my mom's British, that there are laws, that apply to things like national security at a level that would not stand a minute scrutiny in the United States. And I actually think we're better for not having the kind of strict national security laws that Canada, Britain, and Australia have.
When we're talking about free speech and how far it's legitimate to go with deplatforming and all the other things you talked about, there's one obvious sort of measure of this, and it's when the speech incites violence. And I think many people could settle on that quite happily, and that anything that doesn't incite violence is okay. But we're so far from that now, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and this is something. I'm the rude American when I go talk about the American Constitution and particularly the First Amendment when I speak in Europe about this, because the polite constitutional lawyer thing to do is just say, oh, you guys are totally right on all this stuff, and I make it a good argument for actually the American First Amendment being far better thought out than a lot of Europeans understand, because we don't allow for incitement. We just have a strong definition of incitement. Threats, and this is something we're starting to see, to some degree on campus, are something that would put a reasonable person in fear of bodily harm or death. Absolutely not protected. Defamation is not protected, but we have strong protections to make sure that that politicians can't misuse it. So I actually think there's a lot more common sense embedded in the American First Amendment than sometimes I think Europeans appreciate.
I was struck that you described yourself earlier in this interview as centre left, and I suspect you might feel the need to say it.
Oh, yeah. Which I hate, by the way, and it's something that I take on in the book. So one thing that we do that I had some fun with, and that I think is something it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, is try to get people to think of cancel culture as just the most extreme tactic in a dysfunctional way of arguing. That cancel culture is sort of I don't like your opinion, and I'm going to find out something you wrote 40 years ago to make sure that that I ruin your life or you lose your job, and that nobody else wants to actually make that argument again. Basically, it's a tactic for scaring people out of disagreeing with you, and then we situate the whole thing in a larger dysfunctional way of arguing. And we point out the right and the left have what we call rhetorical fortresses. And the step one, of course, on the right is labeling someone liberal or more likely woke as a way of dismissing them. And of course, since we're talking about just name calling, this means that, staunch conservatives are routinely called woke if they think it's going to be a tactic to use against them. But on the left, I mean, I have to admit this. Like when I got to Stanford Law School, which was a big honor in my career, I definitely, and also I came from a poorer background than most of the people that I went to school with, so it was a real culture shock. But I will absolutely admit that if you could do the thing where you kind of indicate that author or that thinker is conservative, it was kind of taken for granted that you could just kind of check that person off your list of people to take seriously. And these are, intelligent, highly educated people. But still, when you watch the way we debate in the United States, often on the left, it is this game of, can I label you a conservative? And even if you're not, as soon as I'm convinced you are, I don't have to listen to you anymore. And we make the point that that's arguing like children.
Yeah. Earlier, you were talking about the sort of factors that you identified in the coddling of the American mind that have
Yes.
led us here. Can you just? I mean, is there any parallel with the McCarthy era, or is this just different in every respect?
It's quite different in a lot of ways, and you are right that the size of American higher education was smaller back in the 50s, but also, like I said, it wasn't clear that universities couldn't hire and fire whoever they wanted prior to 1957 in the United States. One thing that is very different and is that generally in American history, and actually in most countries' history, the thing that leads to what I would describe somewhat clumsily as a mass censorship event is a war or a national security crisis. And that's the most typical circumstance in which you see major crackdowns on freedom of speech. And certainly, sometimes Americans who don't know their history very well can forget how utterly terrifying the Korean War was, for example, and the fact that we were aware of British and American spies. That wasn't dreamt up. There really were people giving the Soviets technology that actually helped them speed up the development of both the atom and the hydrogen bomb. This is very well established at this point. So there was a scary international circumstance. Whereas now it's not about a national security threat. At least it hasn't been since 2014. It's about this weird. It's oftentimes about sort of almost like catching someone in a faux pas. Saying something kind of dumb on Twitter and then really going after their life. And on campus, unfortunately, given that campuses these days do tend to be much more politically homogenous, it behaves a lot more like blasphemy. I actually think the best parallel for for cancel culture in American history is the Victorian age. Because the Victorian age it went after things that were seen to be indecent and blasphemous, heretical, etc. But it came from, one, tended to come a lot more upper classes down, and from a cultural, quasi-religious sentiment. And I think that, honestly, the best parallel to what's going on today is something that looks a lot more like the Victorian age than any other period.
You think that's interesting? It's not religion, obviously, is it? But it's got parallels with religious censoriousness.
It's got religiosity. This is an argument that John McWhorter, who's a friend, wrote in a book called Woke Racism. But he makes the example that it does a lot of the seriousness and commitment to sort of I think he even calls it like the social justice hymnal, is the way he puts it, does seem to be taking the place of religion in a lot of people's lives. And I asked my co-author, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, do you think that's a metaphor, or do you think it's literally taking the place of religion in people's lives? And he very confidently answered, no, I think that a lot of this is literally taking on sort of a religious importance in people's minds, which is one of the reasons why in cancel culture, forgiveness, mercy, etc., can be so hard to come by if you're a blasphemer.
Right. It's very interesting you say that, because I've always thought that the environmental movement has a religiosity about it, but I'm going to have to think now whether you could extend it to this, because the absence of religion has left a vacuum, probably.
Oh no, I definitely think so, and it's funny because I also come from an environmentalist background, but I also, when I was doing human rights law, I was always the person like, so what are we going to do that's going to save the most lives? So I tend to be very pragmatic about like what's the policy initiative we could do that will decrease carbon the most, and sometimes I felt like I got from some of the people I worked with. It wasn't a good solution unless people had to sort of personally sacrifice and suffer, and that feels like a religious instinct to me.
Yeah, Puritanism. Yeah. If I were to say to you, if Twitter and the other social media platforms didn't exist, we'd have less of a problem. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Doubtless. So I don't think that Twitter and social media have created all the problems we have in the world, but they did create some new ones, and they certainly sped a lot of pre-existing problems up. And by creating new ones. I mean, and I want people really, because we've gotten so used to people like me complaining about the effect of social media, we kind of forget what a big difference it is for the human race. And so when I was studying the First Amendment, actually, you might enjoy this, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty in England, um, to actually, because that's actually where we got a lot of our ideas for prior restraint First Amendment law. And that goes back to the licensing of the printing press in England, basically like having the crown say that only licensed printers can print, and that's a way of controlling speech in the country. And so I got to study a lot about Henry VIII and Elizabeth. And essentially, people need to remember that the printing press, the original disruptive technology, that brought several million people into the global conversation. And in many ways, at least in the short term, it was a disaster. It led to religious wars. It led to civil unrest. It led to an increase in the witch trials, which is something that people generally don't know. One of the best sellers was actually the Maleficorum, the book that helps you identify witches. Um, so in the short term, there was no way it couldn't be disruptive, because you added millions and millions of people to the global discussion. So anytime you do that, it's going to be disruptive. In the last 15 years, we've added billions of people to the global conversation in a way that, to be completely clear, has never even vaguely existed before. This many people being able to talk directly to them, to each other in real time. And so a lot of times I see, even my co-author, John Haidt, there's a sense that maybe regulation can put the genie back in the bottle. And my answer is no. Like, after the printing press was invented, there was nothing Henry VIII could do to put the genie back in the bottle. This is going to be a crazy period, and we have to learn how to navigate it in a much weirder world.
But that's not quite right, is it? Because they did start licensing papers after the printing press came in. They said you can't publish what you want. They did bring in free speech limits to control the damage it was causing.
They did, but it didn't work very well. Is what I'm saying. Like the unlicensed printing was very common. Black market writing was everywhere. Basically the attempts to put the printing press genie back in the bottle just didn't work. Not for lack of trying.
Let me just ask you a bit about social media regulation, because it's quite interesting that China is now doing things that I think many in the West would support, many parents anyway, like limiting the amount of time that children can, and really harshly strictly limiting the time that children can spend on social media. And of course, they've also got this very effective mechanism for controlling what people say on social media, to the extent that managers in a company are responsible for all their employees' tweets, and if they don't get them deleted, the ones that the government doesn't like, within 20 minutes or something, they lose their job. So these very, very and it sort of works. I mean, you just said that the post-Tudor stuff didn't work, but I think the Chinese government probably feels it's quite on top of its social media control. Are the Chinese ahead of the West in terms of, they obviously take it in an authoritarian, repressive way, but are they ahead of the West in terms of at least attempting to control some of the damage that's done by social media?
Well, of course they can, because they're an authoritarian, totalitarian country, and they have powers that I'm really glad we don't have, and I think that generally there are actual downsides to that much control over the flow of information. There was a very interesting report done by the United States. And it was right after World War II, and they tried to figure out why the Allies actually won. And one thing that they did point to, and was it George Kennan? No, it was Marshall. George Marshall was actually he was one of the people who led the report. One of the things they did point out was that the free flow of information was one of our superpowers, because in the totalitarian countries, the Nazis, the fascists, but also for that matter, the Soviets, it was harder to know where problems were. It was harder to actually know what needed fixing, et cetera. Whereas even though there was some clampdown both in Britain and the United States, we still had a relatively free press, and that actually made a huge difference. I personally think that if there was a free press in China, COVID never would have broken out of Wuhan.
It seems that TV is to varying degrees regulated, and the press is regulated, libel laws, defamation laws, all the rest of it. And social media is causing new harms, which everyone can see. They're as plain as anything, and they're pretty big ones. And nobody except the Chinese is talking about regulation.
Well, we are talking about regulation quite a bit in the United States. We have to figure out if it's something that fits within the law. But as far as steps that I think are really helpful, for example, schools across the country are now, or at least some schools, are banning the use of cell phones during the day at school. And I think that's just common sense. I think that's healthy. I think it's a way to detox from your social media and from your phone. And so far, it's been incredibly positive for young people. And those are some of the adaptations that I think we need as a society to figure out ways to balance the existence of this technology and also, limit its harms. I talk a lot about free range parenting. One thing that I know is going to be a challenge is keeping your kids off social media. I have a five and a 7-year-old. I think it is actually becoming easier if you are in the right parental community to do that. I may be proven horribly wrong, of course, but I do think there are smart attempts to try to address the problems that are created by social media, and I don't think we need to go full China to address it.
Yeah, I think full China's a terrible idea, but it just seems they've done something. You see this problem
Mm-hmm.
off campus and on campus, and it's becoming part of the American culture. Is it still advancing, or is it in retreat? The cancel culture.
So the number of professors getting fired or punished has been down this year. And what I'm afraid is people are going to get, oh, look, it's all passed. Just like we did in the 90s with political correctness. We're going to say, oh, the fever has passed, so therefore it's over. Meanwhile, I started working in 2001 when everybody thought, things were fine. And I can attest, actually, the problem had moved from it being a problem of the students and the faculty to being something that was that administrators were the ones kind of pushing punishing students and faculty for what they said. And it happened, with less media glare around it. But we are right now seeing fewer professors getting in trouble than we did in, say, 2021 and 2020, and for that matter, 2022. But also, that was an all-time high. So that was just, I'm amazed they can find, with such low viewpoint diversity, I'm amazed they can find this many heretics to burn, I often joke. And in terms of things that were especially bad in the past couple of years, it's been shout downs in the United States. We had at my alma mater, Stanford, had a crazy shout down of a Fifth Circuit judge. About a fifth of the class showed up to shout them down, and then an administrator got up and gave a speech about whether or not free speech was, if the juice of free speech was worth the squeeze. It was painful to listen to. This happened at Yale. Robbie George, famous conservative professor, was just shouted down a couple of weeks ago. This happened at San Francisco State University, where the university actually seemed to side with the students doing the shouting down. There were rocks being thrown at conservatives, just a couple months ago. So I think that it's, and given what's going on with Hamas and Israel, I think, the rumors of the deaths of cancel culture are going to feel greatly exaggerated the next year. Oh, and for that matter, Trump, the election next year, I mean, it's going to be, I'm not looking forward to 2024, and I feel like 2024 has begun early, given all the horrors we're seeing abroad.
Yeah, and when you do your work trying to protect these people or advise them, what's the most effective tactic you've got?
Honestly, if you're a student or faculty member, it's to contact my organization, because the most effective thing we have is a ton of experience trying to help students and faculty in the real world. There are many, many cases, by the way, that the most important thing you can do is make sure that people know that you're being targeted. Because so often on campus, the speech that you're getting in trouble for isn't even particularly offensive, at least by everybody else's standards. And just seeking out my organization, The Fire, we can help you navigate that. And sometimes it seems counterintuitive that to be better known actually makes you better protected, but it's almost always the case. There are some cases when the speech might be less sympathetic, or that the harm actually much more clear, where actually litigation is the best way to go. That isn't all cases, but in some cases, actually litigation is the right way to go, and being able to distinguish those cases from each other is important. I do think that there's something that every individual can do to help with the problem of cancel culture, is just, first, stand up for your friends. If you see someone getting piled on, even though it might make you a tactic, it might make you a target, the more people are willing to say, hey, this is my friend and they're a good person, that can really help diffuse it. There was an attempt to get Steve Pinker at Harvard canceled in 2020, and that was completely diffused by people who respected him going, nope, he is a great scholar, he's a great writer, back off. So it can be defeated just by power of numbers. But also, for a really advanced technique, standing up for people you disagree with, which is something that I think we understood better in both of our countries maybe 20 years ago, saying, I may disagree with what this person says. But
In terms of reversing the trend, my
yeah.
final question to you, reversing this cultural development, and you've ruled out heavy regulation of Twitter and all those things. Can you see this turning round, or is it just going to get worse?
I honestly think the most important thing we need to do is find, and this is how, to give you a sense of how pessimistic I am about some of this, we need other mechanisms. Basically, America needs to be finding its leaders from different institutions. It's one of the reasons why I'm enthusiastic about experiments like the University of Texas at Austin, which is a small startup college trying to be a non-ideological kind of classic liberal arts school. I think we need experimentation in the way we do K through 12, the way people actually are able to show how smart and hardworking and well-read they are, because I think America's disproportionate reliance on elite higher education is creating distortions in our society that just aren't healthy. Now, to be fair, University of Virginia and University of Chicago are both two schools that actually are trying to buck the trend, and they're actually doing quite a good job of it. But Harvard, for example, in our campus free speech ranking, which factors in 13 different factors, relies on the largest survey of student opinion ever conducted and 4 of the largest databases on student, faculty cancellation, and speech codes and deplatforming. Harvard finished dead last. They actually got a negative score according to our rankings. So a lot of the schools that a lot of our leaders in the United States come from, particularly Harvard and Yale, they do terribly by these standards. And I think to some degree, the only solution is to not get as many leaders from Harvard and Yale.
Greg Lukianoff, thank you very much for giving us so much for your time and explaining the thinking you've been doing on this. Very interesting.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.